Future Fjook here. Something that wasn't mentioned in this interview is that both me and the person I'm interviewing have not played Alternity in over 15 years. 10 to 15 years, anyways. A long time. So take that into consideration when you're listening to the interview about Alternity. And enjoy the interview. Welcome, heroes and villains, to Fjook Enterprises YouTube channel. Take a moment, relax, stop your bickering, and just enjoy the show. I don't view D&D the way that a lot of other people do, and I believe that's because my very first tabletop role-playing game was Alternity, and then I GM'd Star Wars, which Star Wars Revised is kind of like 3.5, but it's also different because it has wounds and mortal damage. It has two different systems. Anyways, for me to ask, what are the mechanics of Alternity?
Dungeons and Dragons uses a system that's pretty commonly called the D20 system, and it's changed and evolved over time. But ultimately, the idea is that you use a 20-sided die to determine a bunch of different checks, pretty much everything other than damage rolls, to determine whether you succeed or you fail. And that's it. There's really only two options. You either succeed at the task or you fail at the task. And then but Alternity's core mechanic probably is the most different, and that it still uses a 20-sided die, but it uses all the other dice much more frequently. And you want lower numbers instead of higher numbers. So essentially, you're trying to roll as low as possible. If I were to break it down really easily like I mentioned, in Dungeons and Dragons, or any D20 system, most of them at least, you roll the die and you want to get as high as possible, and you either succeed or you fail. In Alternity, you roll the die, you want to get as low as possible, and there's 5 levels of success or failure. So there's a critical failure, which is determined, I'll get into that later, but there's a certain number that you want to roll lower than to succeed, and if you get higher than that number, you fail. So there's varying levels of failure. One is critical failure. Then you get into your successes, which would be a marginal success. So like you barely passed. An ordinary success, a good success, and then an amazing success. There is no like critical success in Alternity. No matter how many natural ones you roll, which is a good thing in Alternity, you don't automatically succeed at things. Although, if I remember rules written, you don't automatically succeed at things with a critical success in D&D either. But the number that you need to succeed or fail is determined by adding your ability score, relevant ability score, strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, will, and charisma. There was no wisdom in Alternity. It was straight up will. And actually, it wasn't called charisma either. It was called personality. Yeah, you were gonna correct me there, weren't you? Yeah. So, so for instance, let's just say you want to punch somebody in the face. That would be determined probably by your strength. It could be your dex, but we'll just say strength. And so say you've got, I don't know, we'll just max it out. So a human in Alternity could have a maximum strength score of 14. You could mutate, or you could have cybernetics, modify that number from that point. But like a normal human, max, doesn't matter what level you are, could have 14 strength. And that meant you were like the strongest human on the planet. I'm talking like those dudes that like can bench press, thousands of pounds and like pull trains of buses with their their jowls and stuff. Those guys have 14 strength, according to Alternity. Let's say you're level 1. Well, in Alternity at level 1, you have one rank in unarmed combat. And that was max. You couldn't have any more than one. We in that stat, which meant that your total number was 14 plus 1, so 15. So if you rolled a 16 or higher, you failed. If you rolled a 15 or lower, you would succeed. And then that number would be divided in half. So 15 divided by 2, which would round down to like 7. So between 15 and a 7, ordinary success, and then a 7 to a 4, I think because it rounded up, would be like a good success. And then anything less than a 3 or less would be an amazing success. And then on the flip side, like a 16 or higher would be a failure. And then if you rolled a natural 20, essentially, you would critically fail. And then what would happen is I would determine whether or not if I hit you, say I punched you in the face and I got an ordinary success. Well, every time you did, the level of success would determine how much damage you did. So, for instance, if I remember right, punching people always did D4 damage, and it was like D4 minus 1, D4, and then D4 plus 1. And then on top of that, you had varying levels of health, which was determined by your stamina, what the heck was it? Your stamina was broken into your stun, fatigue, wounds, and then mortal wounds. And your stun and your fatigue would be equal to your constitution score. And then your stun and your wounds were equal to your constitution score, but your fatigue and your mortal wounds were half that number. And punching people always, I think, by default would just be like, you would just do stun damage. So I punch you in the face, I do like D4 stun damage, and then we would kind of go from there. There were a lot more complicated dice rolls that you could do. So, for instance, if we were like fighting on a wobbly ship, and there were like bullets flying over our heads, or we were both, shit-faced drunk and we're in a bar, sort of thing, that would determine whether or not you had pluses or minuses. So kind of like in 5th edition D&D where you gain advantage or disadvantage, in Alternity you would get +1, +2, +3, up to +5, or minus to minus was called. I think it was just called a difficulty slider. So depending on the difficulty of the task, you would add or subtract dice to your D20 roll. And it started with a D4 with a plus, or a -1 would be you would add or subtract a D4. And then it went to a D6 and a D8, and then a D10. And for whatever reason, it would always skip a D12, and it would just go straight to D20. So +1, +2, +3, +4. And then the +5 or -5 was like 2d20. So it basically was like impossible. Or something was super easy. If you had like -5 to your roll, that meant you would roll 2d20, add those numbers together, and then subtract that number from your core d20 roll. So like if I wanted to punch you in the face and you were basically unconscious, I might get like a plus or a minus, sorry. I might get like a -4, which would be a 1d20. So I would roll a d20. Whatever number that was, I would subtract it from my core d20 roll, and that would determine what range I would get into. Man, that's complicated when I say it out loud like that, but
I know that you haven't run Alternity in many years, but you don't roll for your stats, do you, in Alternity?
no. there was only two like stat generation methods by the book at least. And one, which was kind of the normal one, was you would start your game with 60 points to put into your ability scores as you saw fit. Um, you could plus or minus that actually if you wanted to play a game of like, I think the category was called like, it was like heroes was 60 stats, and then like superheroes was 70 stats. Everyday normal guy was like 50 ability points. And you would divide them as you saw fit into the six ability scores: your strength, dex, con, intelligence, will, and personality. So in Alternity, they had a different rule where you didn't actually get a bonus to your stat. You had minimum and maximums. So for instance, for humans, the minimum number you could put into any of your ability scores was 4, which was pretty shit by human standards. So it even had examples of like what each of those abilities. In Alternity, a round is like it's broken into phases. Each phase is about 6 seconds, and a round is when everyone gets their turn. So everybody that's in the combat, when you add up all of their turns together, all of their phases, whatever number that is, that's how long a round is. So just as an example, there's 4 phases. I think there's 4 phases. Yeah. So yeah, about 24 seconds. So each turn is about 24 seconds, and that lasts until everyone has like done their thing. So if there's like, we'll just round it up. If there's 10 combatants, your round could be potentially like 240 seconds.
Are you aware that Alternity came out after TSR was acquired by Wizards of the Coast, but still under the TSR name?
Yes, actually. And I remember that specifically because the very first computer I ever got came with a copy of Icewind Dale in it. And that's when I first ever saw something related to D&D or TSR. And I remember looking at the Alternity book and seeing the logo, the TSR logo, and being like, what the hell? I thought this was like that D&D. I thought this was D&D. And then lo and behold, it's yeah. So yeah, I was aware of that actually. And I think it's kind of neat. Although I am really sad that like nothing's really come of it. Mission is like, it's funny because it's so simple, which is like totally opposite of Alternity. It's such a simple system that it's really, really easy to modify it and still call it the same system.
What things have you taken from DMing Alternity and put into D&D?
Well, not a lot anymore in 5th edition, but like when we were playing 3.5 and Pathfinder, I skipped over 4th mostly. I didn't DM 4th, I should say. I played 4th for a little while. But there were some things that I took away. So I really liked the stamina system that Alternity has. The the stun, wound, fatigue, and mortal. So I actually applied that into into not 5th edition, but into D&D for a while, and it worked out okay. It wasn't like a resounding victory, but it wasn't like a crushing failure or anything like that. Um, all it really did was kind of up the stakes a little bit. Um, Having players sort of keep track of their like stun and their fatigue was a lot more interesting than I thought it would be. Mortal, keeping track of mortal wounds, which I sort of rounded off as like anytime you're critically hit, you would receive a point of mortal, and it would also, because of the way it works in Alternity, is whenever you receive a point of damage, you also receive twice that much damage from a lower bar. So, for instance, if you took a point of mortal, 1 point of mortal means you were like dying. you are like your guts are spilling out or your head has been cracked open. It is really, really bad. It applies a huge amount of negatives or debuffs, disadvantages to your rolls and stuff like that going forward. So you don't want to take mortal damage as much as possible. But if you do take a point of mortal damage, you're also taking like 2 points of fatigue and 2 points of wound. What that also means is that when you take those 2 points of wound, you're taking 4 points of stun. And every time you accumulate a certain amount of wounds and a certain amount of stun, you also get more disadvantages and stuff. So, if you took a point of mortal, you're kind of screwed. But on top of that, you're really screwed because you've got these extra debuffs from the wound that you've taken and these extra debuffs from the stun. So I applied some of that into D&D, which I really liked. And I tried to apply some sort of like minimum maximums to ability scores to make certain races a little bit more realistic. Like instead of the orcs getting +2 strength and +2 con, I just bumped up their maximums. So like this before 5th edition, where 5th edition's max is like 20 in any ability score. I tried to apply that in like 3rd edition, and everyone hated it. So it like quickly shoved it aside. We did implement a system of like synergies. So in Alternity, when you have a certain amount of ranks in certain skills, they will synergize with other skills. I know that it applied in D&D. Like I know if you had like 5 for every like 5 ranks in acrobatics you would get like a +1 bonus to your tumble checks. And every 5 ranks in tumble you had gave you like +1 bonus to your AC. Something like that was in there already. In Alternity, it was sort of the same. Like if you had a certain number of ranks in combat blades, so like swords, well, it went from anything from like a dagger to like a combat knife to a sword to like a chainsaw sword, a lightsaber. Though it wasn't a lightsaber; it was called a star blade or something like that. They all use that combat blade skill. So if you had a certain amount of ranks in that, it would actually apply to your martial arts skill. Or if you had a certain amount of ranks in your martial arts skill, it would apply to your like daredevil skill or your acrobatics or your like it wasn't athletics, but I can't remember what it would have been called. Some of those athletic abilities were actually under Constitution, so like running, climbing, swimming. If you had a certain amount of ranks in those abilities, it would apply to other things like your armor operation. So you could operate armor easier if you were particularly athletic. Or if you were really good at swimming, it sort of like assumed that you were good at like maneuvering around in space. Likewise, if you were good at maneuvering around in space, it assumed you were a good daredevil, which was a skill all by itself that was all about like, skydiving or surfing or like skateboarding and, just being generally like cool as, like in the 90s kind of cool, like extreme. So
What's the difference between personality and charisma and will and wisdom?
personality and charisma wasn't too much of a difference, if any, to be honest. So in D&D, charisma is primarily associated with the way that your character interacts with other people. It has absolutely nothing, well, I shouldn't say absolutely nothing, but it isn't specifically about how your character looks, right? So to emphasize that before we get into personality itself, but to emphasize that you could have a butt ugly orc who has really high charisma. And that high charisma is sort of is more related to his presence. Like when he walks into a room, he has this sort of, aura, draws people's attention. People look at him, people listen to him when he talks, right? Whereas if you could have an absolutely beautiful, I'll just say an elf. You could have this absolutely beautiful elf, but he's got low charisma. No one knows that he's there. He's like a ghost, essentially. He walks into a room. He's super beautiful. He's got his long elven hair, his big goofy ears, and like no one knows that he's there because they're all looking at this big, intimidating orc who's standing in the corner, right? And when he speaks, he draws everyone's attention to him. That's what charisma is in D&D. In Alternity, your personality is that, but it actually is more determined by how your character looks. So it's sort of the opposite. It has more to do with the way that your character physically looks and how that interacts with other people. Your skills that you have that are associated with the personality ability score are what determines how you communicate with other people. So, for instance, in D&D, the skills that run off your charisma are persuasion, intimidation, and deception. In Alternity, the skills that run off of your personality are persuasion, intimidation, deception, but it's also broken into like seduction, performance, and although performance is charisma as well in D&D, but performance, and then presence, I believe, was one of them, and charm. I could be misremembering them a little bit, but there was about 6 of them, and they worked in different ways, right? So, Alternity, just as a general rule of thumb, it's the ability score was more how your character appeared, so like surface level appearance, and in D&D, your charisma determines how you interact with other people, not specifically your appearance. Will and wisdom, though. So in D&D, your wisdom score, your ability score, a lot of people think it is your willpower, but it's not. It actually has nothing to do with it. Although there are a lot of spells in D&D that use your wisdom as a save, I think that's reminiscent of the old mechanics that there used to be saves, your fortitude, reflex, and your will saves, and those were determined by your ability scores. Fortitude was constitution, reflex was dexterity, and will was wisdom. Because of that, a lot of people would kind of mix wisdom and will up, but they're not really the same thing. So to elaborate on that, in Dungeons and Dragons, your wisdom is associated with a couple of different skills: medicine, nature, survival, perception, insight. So these are all things that rely on your ability to kind of like take in information from your surroundings and then come up with a conclusion. Or the ability that'd be more intelligence, I suppose. It would be more accurate to say that it's like your wisdom in D&D is associated with your ability to perceive and understand the world around you. Perception is the most easy to kind of like simulate with it. So it's like if you've got a high perception score and a high wisdom score, you're really perceptive, right? Same with insight. You know how to read people, and you can kind of pick up on those little clues, subtleties, right? Think like a druid. Druid's got high wisdom. They are attuned with the world around them. In Alternity, that's not a thing. That sort of like level of perception is, I think, actually determined by your intelligence score. not your wisdom score. But I could be wrong. What I do remember will being in Alternity is a little bit more on the like your willpower. A good way to describe it would be it determines your resolve, or your ability to like overcome or withstand hardship on a mental level. If you're getting blasted by a scion, um, they're attacking your will. If you're trying to be persuaded, they're also attacking your will. If you're trying to fight against addiction, it goes against your will. If you want to figure out like medicine or perception, or you're trying to read other people, like figure out how they work, it's not coming off of your will. It's coming off of your intelligence, or it's coming off of your personality score. Specifically the skills. In D&D, your ability scores are like prime. They're really, really important numbers. In Alternity, your skills are where everything's at. There's an entire page of skills. There's got to be like, I don't know, 100 skills to choose from in Alternity, and they're much, much more important than the raw ability score than it is in D&D. So to kind of sum it up, I would say that in D&D, your wisdom is your ability to kind of like perceive and attune to the world around you. Whereas in Alternity, your will is literally your willpower. It is your resolve, your mental resolve, your ability to kind of like overcome obstacles, face stress, fight against fear, that kind of stuff. That's what will is in Alternity.
As for my penultimate question, why should someone why should someone in today's world play Alternity?
I think that if you are interested in looking for a system that is, I'm going to say, more realistic, I'm going to assume people are coming from Dungeons and Dragons. If you want to look for a game that's a little bit more complicated, allows for a little bit more, I'm going to say, realism, um, especially in the sci-fi department. Although Alternity does have rules for running a like fantasy setting. Um, I would say that you would want to go with Alternity for that reason. If you're looking for something that's a little bit more complicated, a little bit more realistic, allows for a little bit more mechanical building, and focuses specifically on skill points. Skill points are king in Alternity. Um, as an example, if you have 14 intelligence, you'd start with 70 skill points and 7 broad skills. Skills are divided between broad skills and specialty skills. Um, in Dungeons and Dragons, you kind of want to like specialize in things really early on. In Alternity, you want to spread your skills out as much as possible, and then as you grow and like become who you're supposed to be, level up, then you begin to specialize in things. So my favorite thing about Alternity has to be the skills and what you can do with them and how important they are. Um, so that's probably what I would say if you're looking into a new system, especially one that's focused on science fiction. I would recommend you look at Alternity.
Any as my final question as my final question always is, do you have anything or anyone you would like to shout out at this time?
Uh, Not really. I would say, um, sort of in regards to Alternity, it is very difficult to find physical copies of Alternity stuff. But I have been really successful in finding and getting access to digital copies of Alternity. Um, So it's not like it's impossible to find anymore. Like I've got books that are still in their plastic because I'm probably never going to find them, and until I absolutely need to open them, I'm not opening them. But I would say it's definitely worth getting a look at.
Thank you.
But
Thank you for joining me today.
yeah, it was. It's fun to talk about it. It's definitely my. I still think, even with how much I play Dungeons and Dragons, I still think Alternity is like my favorite system, and I'd really like to play it again if I could find some people who would be interested in learning it. I guess, um, but with D&D being the powerhouse that it is lately, I doubt that that's going to happen anytime soon. But I'll still have all my books here. They're not going anywhere anytime soon.